Have you ever wondered why an elephant always gives birth only to a baby elephant?
Right.
And like not some other animal? Or why a mango seed only makes a mango plant and not, I don't know, an apple tree?
It's a fundamental question.
Yeah, and given that they do, are the offspring identical to their parents? Or do they show differences in some of their characteristics? Have you ever wondered why siblings sometimes look so similar to each other or, sometimes completely different?
Those exact questions form the absolute bedrock of the biological sciences. For thousands of years, humans just observed these ironclad rules of nature operating right in plain sight.
Without knowing how they work.
Exactly, completely unaware of the molecular machinery driving them. You look around and you see this relentless replication, but with just enough subtle deviation to make every single organism unique.
Yeah, and as I was going through the source material for today's deep dive, the core paradox of that replication really struck me. I mean, it was a real aha moment.
Oh, really? Tell
Yeah.
me about that.
Well, we're opening Chapter 5 today, exploring the principles of inheritance and variation, right? And the very first thing that jumps out is that nature's greatest trick isn't just its ability to copy itself.
Right.
It's the fact that it never, ever copies itself perfectly.
Yes, that is the critical insight.
Because if the copying mechanism were flawless, we'd essentially just be a planet of static clones.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Right. We'd be highly susceptible to a single environmental shift or a pathogen. Okay, so let's unpack this. We are officially opening the deep dive into Chapter 5.
And that gets right to the heart of the matter. Before we even, define the terms in this chapter, we have to ask a bigger question.
Like why it's in the syllabus.
Well, yes, but scientifically, why does this topic even exist? What biological problem is being solved here? For you listening right now, especially if you're preparing for a highly competitive, high-stakes exam like Neet, you cannot just, memorize the syllabus.
Rote memorization will kill your score.
It absolutely will. You have to understand the biological imperative behind it. The concepts in this chapter represent, I'd argue, the greatest tug of war in the history of life on Earth.
A tug of war between what and what?
Well, on one side, an organism desperately needs a mechanism for continuity. The baseline blueprint of a species has to be preserved at all costs.
Because otherwise the species just ceases to exist.
Precisely.
So that's the elephant needing to make an elephant. If the blueprint degrades, the structural integrity of the organism fails.
Yeah, but on the other side of that tug of war is the absolute necessity for change. The environment is not static. Climates shift, new predators evolve, novel viruses emerge.
So if an entire population shares the exact same flawlessly copied genetic code...
A single vulnerability can result in total extinction.
Wow. Okay, this is a biological tension.
It is, and the study of that precise tension, that balance between keeping the species intact while generating enough flexibility to survive a changing environment, that is the foundation of genetics.
That's our mission today.
Exactly. Our goal today is to tear this chapter down to its molecular studs. We're going to look at the exact mechanisms that mediate this tension, and we're tailoring this specifically to help you master these concepts.
So deeply that no examiner will be able to trap you.
Exactly. No clever phrasing or conceptual technicalities will trip you up.
Let's start building that mental map right now then. The text provides a very strict dual-natured definition of genetics.
It does.
It isn't just the study of genes, which is how people usually throw the word around casually. The source material defines genetics as the subject that deals with the inheritance as well as the variation of characters from parents to offspring.
It is an inseparable package deal. It's an overarching umbrella. And underneath it, you have those two distinct pillars.
Inheritance and variation.
Right. Inheritance is the mechanism. It's the rule that dictates the passing of characters from parent to progeny.
So elephants make elephants.
Yes. And variation is the measurement of the difference that occurs during that handover, the exception to the exact rule. The baby elephant has slightly different ears than the parent.
Okay, I'm tracking.
But I want to draw your attention, and I mean really draw the listener's attention, to a very specific sentence in the text, because this is where students consistently lose points on multiple choice questions.
Let's hear it.
The text explicitly states, quote, "Inheritance is the process by which characters are passed on from parent to progeny. It is the basis of heredity," end quote.
Okay, let's pause there because I can easily see how someone, speed reading late at night might treat the words inheritance and heredity as just interchangeable synonyms.
Oh, it happens all the time.
But the biology is telling us something specific. If inheritance is the process, Does that mean the actual physical segregation of chromosomes during meiosis, like the physical movement we see in anaphase, is the literal embodiment of inheritance?
That is exactly the biological manifestation. Inheritance is a verb. It's the sequence of events. From DNA replication to crossing over to the formulation of gametes to fertilization.
The actual moving parts.
Yes, the physical biochemical transmission. Heredity, on the other hand, is the overarching phenomenon. Heredity is the observable reality that traits are shared across generations.
So inheritance is the physical vector, and heredity is the resulting concept. Because the physical process of inheritance occurs, the biological phenomenon of heredity exists.
That's the perfect way to phrase it.
That makes perfect sense. The trap, I imagine, is an examiner swapping those two concepts.
Oh, they love doing that. You'll frequently see exam statements that read, heredity is the process by which characters are passed on, and it forms the basis of inheritance.
And that sounds correct if you aren't paying attention.
Right. Under the pressure of a ticking clock, a stressed student reads that, recognizes all the vocabulary words, and marks it as correct. But it is conceptually backward.
The physical process must serve as the foundation, the basis for the phenomenon, not the other way around.
Exactly. Process versus basis. Mark that down.
That's a critical distinction for the mental map.
Mm-hmm.
Now, looking at the second pillar, variation, the text defines variation as the degree by which progeny differ from their parents.
Yes.
Why is the word degree so biologically significant here? I mean, it seems to imply something more than just a binary different or identical.
Because it implies a spectrum.
Yeah.
And that is vital for understanding evolutionary biology. Variation isn't just a switch that flips on or off. It is a quantitative measure.
Think of it like human height.
Right. Perfect example. Human height, skin pigmentation, milk yield in cattle. These are polygenic traits.
Traits controlled by multiple genes
Interacting with each other and with the environment. The degree of difference gives natural selection the raw granular material it needs to work with. Examiners love testing the word degree because it demonstrates that you understand variation as a measurable, continuous spectrum.
Not just a qualitative anomaly.
Exactly. Not just, oh, he has a mutation.
Right. So if we look at the roadmap of Chapter 5, as laid out in the syllabus, this interplay between the rule and the exception governs the entire flow, doesn't it?
It absolutely dictates the structure of the chapter.
Like, we start with Section 5.1, Mendel's Laws of Inheritance. This is where we establish the absolute foundational rules of the process pillar before we even know what DNA is.
And understanding Mendel's methodology is just as important as knowing his laws. Before you can grasp the complexities of molecular genetics, you must understand the macroscopic rules.
Because Mendel didn't have microscopes powerful enough to see chromosomes.
No, not at all. He used pure breeding lines of Pisum sativum, the garden pea, and applied mathematical logic to biological phenomena, which was a completely revolutionary approach at the time.
Yeah, combining math and biology was practically unheard of. Then the chapter progresses to Section 5.2, Inheritance of one gene, and Section 5.3, Inheritance of two genes.
Right.
This feels like the classic scientific method to me. Isolate a single variable first. Watch how a monohybrid cross works. Track a single trait like plant height to establish the 3.1 phenotypic ratio, and only then introduce the complexity of a dihybrid cross.
To observe independent assortment, that progression is very deliberate. You have to understand how alleles segregate independently before you can understand the exceptions to those rules.
Like linkage.
Like linkage or incomplete dominance. Once that basic Mendelian framework is established, Section 5.4 moves to sex determination.
Applying the laws to a real-world question.
Exactly. The syllabus takes these abstract theoretical laws and applies them to a massive, tangible biological question. How is the sex of an organism determined across different species?
So we go from Mendel's peas to the XXXY system in humans.
And the ZZZW system in birds, and the XO system in insects.
But then, looking at the map, the syllabus takes a sharp turn in Section 5.5 with mutation. Because up to this point, we've been operating under the assumption that the biological machinery is working perfectly.
Flawlessly, yeah.
Mutation introduces the breakdown of the code. It's the ultimate origin of the variation pillar we were discussing earlier.
It is the ultimate origin. While sexual reproduction shuffles the existing deck of genetic cards through recombination and independent assortment, Mutation is the mechanism that actually introduces new cards into the deck.
Whether it's a point mutation changing a single base pair or a massive chromosomal aberration.
Yes, this is where the sequence is fundamentally altered, and that directly leads into the final topic of the chapter, section 5.6, genetic disorders.
Which represents the real-world consequences of those mutations. When the code breaks, and those broken codes are subjected to the process of inheritance, the resulting heredity manifests as genetic disorders.
Conditions like sickle cell anemia, hemophilia, Down syndrome.
The entire chapter is a brilliantly structured narrative. It moves from the discovery of the basic laws to the mathematical application to the breakdown of the code, and finally to the pathological consequences in human biology.
And let me tell you, when you structure your studying along that narrative arc, the details suddenly have a logical place to live in your brain. You aren't just memorizing disconnected facts about chromosomes.
You're following a story.
You're following a sequential story of how biological continuity and change are maintained. So, what does this all mean? It means biology isn't random. It's a progression from basic laws to a complex biological realities.
That mental map is so crucial. But let's shift gears slightly. Let's get into the historical context provided in the text.
Okay.
Because this section contains what I consider one of the most fascinating exam traps and honestly one of the most mind-blowing biological realities.
That's a great section.
The text explicitly states, quote, humans knew from as early as 8,000 to 1,000 BC that one of the causes of variation was hidden in sexual reproduction.
Yeah. Here's where it gets really interesting for the exam. That specific timeline, 8,000 to 1,000 BC, is a goldmine for an examiner. They are looking to trick a student who relies on common assumptions.
Because the average person thinks genetics is a modern thing.
Exactly. The average underprepared student assumes that genetics is purely a 19th or 20th century invention. They think of Gregor Mendel and his monastery in the 1850s, or Watson and Crick discovering the double helix.
We suffer from this terrible chronological snobbery. We view our ancient ancestors as just stumbling around in the dark, entirely ignorant of the natural world.
But 8,000 BC corresponds with the Neolithic revolution.
Right, the transition from nomadic hunter-gatherer societies to settled agrarian civilizations, the dawn of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and the Indus Valley.
And to successfully execute that transition, they had to become observational biologists. The text is definitive on this point. Thousands of years before the scientific method, before microscopes, before anyone knew what a cell was.
Human beings deduced that the cause of biological variation was specifically linked to the mechanism of sexual reproduction.
Yes, I can easily see how that becomes a multiple choice trap. An exam question might ask, according to historical records, early humans attributed the cause of variation to.
And the options might be environmental factors, divine intervention, asexual propagation, or sexual reproduction.
And if you haven't read the textbook closely, you might guess environmental factors. Or divine intervention. You'd assume ancient people wouldn't understand the intricacies of reproduction.
But the text leaves no ambiguity.
None. They observed that crossbreeding specific plants or mating specific animals yielded progeny that possessed traits from both parents, but with new, unique variations. They recognized the input and the output of sexual reproduction.
And the text provides a highly specific, geographically grounded example to cement this point.
The Sahiwal cows in Punjab.
Yes. This is where we really need to dig deeply into the biology of domestication. The text states that Indian breeds like the Sahiwal cow were developed through artificial selection and domestication from ancestral wild cows.
Okay, let's break down the exact phrasing the exam will target. We have three specific components here: artificial selection, domestication, and ancestral wild cows.
What are the specific biological mechanics examiners expect a student to understand there?
Let's isolate artificial selection first, because it is frequently confused with natural selection.
Right. Natural selection is driven by environmental pressures. Nature dictates which traits confer a survival advantage,
Allowing those organisms to live long enough to reproduce. But artificial selection, it's entirely human-directed. It is a massive, deliberate violation of the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium.
because mating is no longer random.
Exactly.
The early agrarian societies in the Indus Valley weren't letting nature dictate the survival of the herd. They acted as a targeted evolutionary pressure themselves.
They looked at a population of wild ancestral cows, likely the aurochs or early Bos indicus populations, and selected specific individuals based entirely on human utility.
So they identified traits like higher milk yield, docile temperament, resilience to the extreme heat.
And tick-borne diseases prevalent in the Punjab region. By systematically breeding only the individuals that displayed these traits, they forced a rapid shift in allele frequencies within that captive population.
And over generations, this intense directional selection led to domestication, which introduces a fascinating biological bottleneck, doesn't it? By deliberately selecting for docility and milk yield, they were severely restricting the gene pool.
Domestication syndrome often results in a loss of overall genetic diversity compared to the ancestral wild populations. It makes the domestic breed highly specialized but potentially more vulnerable to novel diseases.
That's the trade-off.
It is the exact trade-off of artificial selection. But what makes the Sahiwal cow such a high-yield exam topic is the starting material. The text emphasizes that these breeds were created from ancestral wild cows.
Meaning they weren't made from scratch.
Right. Examiners will try to trick you by suggesting that early humans genetically engineered these traits, or that the Sahiwal cow naturally evolved in isolation, or that it was bred from other already domesticated European breeds.
You have to remember the sequence. Ancestral wild populations subjected to human-directed artificial selection, resulting in domestication.
Do not just remember cows in Punjab. Remember how they got there and what they came from.
Thinking about those ancient farmers in Punjab leads to a massive realization for me. We are talking about human beings operating without a shred of molecular knowledge.
None.
They didn't know what a nucleotide was. They didn't understand the concept of dominant and recessive alleles. Yet, they successfully manipulated the biological trajectory of an entire mammalian species.
They effectively hacked this system of genetics using nothing but generational observation.
That's incredible.
What's fascinating here is that early humans didn't create these traits. The most profound biological truth in the text explains how they did it.
What does it say?
The text states, they exploited the variations that were naturally present in the wild populations of plants and animals. I want you to focus intensely on the phrase, naturally present.
Naturally present. Because the instinct is to think that humans created the traits we wanted. We wanted more milk, so we somehow induced the cow to make more milk.
Which is biologically impossible without modern genetic engineering.
Right. Early humans did not invent the genetic sequence for high milk yield. They didn't invent the physical adaptations for heat tolerance, like the Sahiwal's distinctive loose skin and sweat glands.
Those physiological traits already existed. They existed as standing genetic variation within the wild population. Nature provided a vast menu of random genetic mutations and recombinations. Human desire simply reviewed the menu and placed an order.
We simply selected for organisms that possessed desirable characters. We functioned as a selective sweep.
Yes.
A specific character is only desirable within the context of the environment. In the wild, producing excessive amounts of milk is biologically expensive. It requires a massive caloric intake and might actually be a disadvantage for a wild cow trying to survive a harsh winter or evade predators.
But to a human settlement requiring a stable food source, that exact same trait becomes the most highly desirable character imaginable.
We just exploited what the machinery of mutation and independent assortment had already produced.
But this brings us to a glaring, almost comical contradiction at the end of this introductory text.
The great ancestral blind spot.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a massive paradox. The authors explicitly note, we must, however, recognize that though our ancestors knew about the inheritance of characters and variation, they had very little idea about the scientific basis of these phenomena.
It's staggering. You have these ancient agriculturalists fundamentally reshaping the biosphere, selectively breeding the Sahiwal cow, turning wild Tisenti grass into modern maize, selectively cultivating wheat. Yet they were entirely blind to the scientific mechanisms driving their own success.
Practice predated theory by 10,000 years. They recognized the macro-level inputs and outputs. They knew that if you bred the cow that produced the most milk with a bull from a high-yield lineage, the probability of the calf being a high-yield producer was significant.
But the biological black box between the input and the output, the actual molecular basis of heredity, was entirely unknown to them.
Completely.
You know, if we use a modern analogy, it's like using a complex software application through its user interface.
Oh, I like that.
I can click buttons on a screen to manipulate data perfectly, achieving exactly the results I want, without having a single clue about how to write the underlying source code in Python or C++ plain Pisc. Ancient humans mastered the biological user interface.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. They mastered the user interface. But the entire purpose of Chapter 5, The reason you must study Mendelian genetics, chromosomal theory, and molecular biology is to finally look at the source code.
Because trial and error via artificial selection is incredibly slow.
It takes hundreds of generations. It's unpredictable. Sometimes you get the Sahiwal cow, and sometimes you inadvertently breed in a lethal recessive trait because you don't understand genetic linkage.
Right. Understanding the scientific basis, opening up that black box, is the only way to move from observational agriculture to targeted precision.
It is the foundation of modern medicine, gene therapy, molecular diagnostics. We're no longer constrained to just pushing buttons on the interface. We are actively learning how the operating system itself is programmed.
And that transition from observation to molecular understanding is exactly what examiners expect you to master.
Exactly. So before you walk into that exam hall or before you close the book on this introductory section, let's crystallize the most critical high-yield concepts we discussed today.
Let's do it. Let's lock in the mental map.
Here's what you must remember. I'm addressing you, the listener, directly. Lock in these absolute core facts from the source material.
Anchor number 1. Genetics is not a single concept. It is the unbreakable equation of inheritance plus variation. Inheritance is the biological rule that preserves species continuity, and variation is the biological exception that allows for evolutionary survival.
Anchor number 2. Here is what you must remember regarding the passing of traits. Do not let examiners confuse the vocabulary. Inheritance is the process, the physical, biological sequence of events. Heredity is the overarching concept. Because inheritance happens, heredity exists. Inheritance is the basis of heredity.
Anchor number 3. Shifting to the historical context, here's what you must remember. Do not assume genetics is solely a modern science. The timeline is 8,000 to 1,000 BC. During the Neolithic Revolution, our ancestors definitively identified that the cause of biological variation was tied to sexual reproduction.
Anchor number 4. When we look at how they applied that knowledge, here's what you must remember. Early agriculturalists did not invent traits. They exploited variations that were naturally present in wild populations. Nature's random mutations provided the standing genetic variation, and humans applied artificial selection.
Anchor number 5. Tying it all to the textbook's primary example, here's what you must remember. The Sahiwal cows in Punjab are the definitive example of human-directed evolution. You must associate this breed with 3 specific things: artificial selection, domestication, and descent from ancestral wild cows.
They are the product of manipulating allele frequencies long before the scientific basis was understood. Let's synthesize all of this into a rapid, cohesive, 60-second sticky summary. Think of this as the master narrative you can recall instantly.
I'll take this one. Elephants make elephants because of inheritance. Siblings look different because of variation. Together, they make genetics. Early humans figured out sexual reproduction caused this variation between 8,000 and 1,000 BC. They used artificial selection on wild cows to make Sahiwal cows in Punjab, proving you can hack biology without knowing the science. And that science is what we will explore through Mendel's laws, mutations, and disorders in this chapter.
That is a flawless foundation for the rest of the chapter. But before we wrap up this deep dive, that concept of the ancestral blind spot leaves us with a rather unsettling but necessary scientific question.
It really forces a mirror on our own era.
This raises an important question. The text tells us our ancestors selectively bred animals like the Sahiwal cow, exploiting variations without having any idea about the underlying scientific basis. They acted with supreme confidence despite their foundational ignorance.
Which raises the obvious question, what are we doing today that mimics that exact same hubris?
Exactly. We sit here in the modern era, surrounded by complex systems. We heavily utilize CRISPR and gene editing. We deploy massive machine learning models and artificial intelligence algorithms. We introduce novel synthetic chemicals into global ecosystems.
And we assume we have it all figured out.
My final thought for you to ponder is this. What modern, hyper-complex systems are we currently manipulating in our modern world where we, just like our ancestors, might be completely blind to the true scientific basis underneath? Are we exploiting systems for our own desirable characters without understanding the long-term consequences?
Are we still just playing with the user interface, assuming we understand the source code of the biosphere, when in reality we barely know how to read the language?
It's a stark reminder that biological knowledge is rarely absolute. It is continually evolving. Knowing how to exploit a system is profoundly different from understanding the holistic consequences of why it works.
And that is precisely why rigorous scientific study matters. We aren't just memorizing textbook definitions to pass an exam. We are studying the principles of inheritance and variation to ensure we don't repeat the blind spots of the past on a molecular scale.
Keep studying hard. Keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the very foundation of biological continuity and change. Keep your mental map sharp, be vigilant for those subtle conceptual exam traps, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.